Today's story takes us to the chilling halls of Hill House, a mansion with a sinister history of tragedy and fear. Many who've dared to stay there have been driven to madness, haunted by eerie whispers and terrifying visions that seem to seep from the walls themselves. As night falls, Hill House stirs to life, and those inside can't escape the feeling that something dark is watching. Is Hill House simply a home with a tragic past, or is it truly cursed? If you're drawn to true crime, haunting, and mystery stories, you're in the right place. We upload twice a week, so be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Share in the comments which true crime, haunting, or mystery you'd like us to explore next. Now, let's enter the dark mystery of Hill House. Hill House stood alone, dark and foreboding against the backdrop of the hills. It loomed over the landscape like a forgotten giant, its jagged edges cutting sharply into the sky. For decades, rumors of its malevolence spread far and wide. People spoke in whispers about the strange happenings within its walls, events that no one could quite explain. Now, it was about to host a new group of visitors, each with their own reasons for being drawn to the house's mystery. Little did they know, they would leave with much more than they expected. Dr. John Montague, a scholar of the supernatural, was the one who had orchestrated this visit. A methodical man with a quiet obsession, he had spent years collecting accounts of haunted places, but Hill House was different. It had a reputation that made even the most hardened skeptic shudder. It wasn't just another haunted house. It was something worse, something alive in its own way. Dr. Montague believed that if he could document its phenomena, he would finally have the proof he needed to establish his theories on the supernatural. The doctor had invited 3 others to accompany him for the summer. Eleanor Vance was the first to accept the invitation. She was a woman who, for most of her life, had been invisible to the world. At 32, Eleanor had spent her youth caring for her ailing mother in a life of solitude. When her mother passed, Eleanor was left with nothing but her bitterness and regret. The invitation from Dr. Montague offered her something she had never had, an escape. Eleanor had no home to speak of, no career, and no one waiting for her anywhere. The idea of escaping to Hill House, even with its dark reputation, was better than returning to her sister's house, where she was nothing more than an unwanted burden. As she drove through the countryside, Eleanor felt a rush of exhilaration, a fleeting sense of freedom she hadn't known in years. But as the miles disappeared behind her and Hill House drew nearer, an uneasy feeling began to creep in. The second guest was Theodora, an artist with a sharp wit and a tendency to hide her true emotions behind laughter and sarcasm. She was everything Eleanor wasn't: confident, carefree, and vibrant. Dr. Montague had chosen her because of her supposed psychic sensitivity, although Theodora never took such things seriously. For her, this was just another adventure, a way to pass the time during the summer. Luke Sanderson, the final member of the group, was the heir to Hill House. Though he had never set foot inside it before, Luke wasn't thrilled about spending his time in a place everyone in his family avoided. But he was obliged to join the others, both because it was his inheritance and because his aunt insisted. To him, Hill House was simply an old structure, nothing more. He wasn't particularly interested in the supernatural, but he wasn't about to turn down the opportunity to meet new people and enjoy some good company. The 3 guests arrived separately, each with their own expectations, but all were struck by the sight of Hill House when they first laid eyes on it. Its towering walls seemed to lean toward them, as if they were being drawn into its grasp. The house was more than just unsettling. It was wrong in some unspoken way. The architecture was deliberately designed to disorient, with sharp angles and strange curves that made the house feel unnatural. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, ready to trap anyone foolish enough to step inside. Eleanor was the first to arrive, her heart pounding as she approached the iron gates. She hesitated, gripping the wheel of her car tightly. Her first instinct was to turn back, to leave Hill House and never look back. But something kept her there. Perhaps it was her longing for a place where she could belong. Or perhaps it was something darker, an unspoken pull from the house itself. With a deep breath, Eleanor pushed forward, driving through the gates and up the gravel road toward the house. As she parked and stepped out of the car, the stillness of the place enveloped her. No birds sang, no wind stirred the trees. It was as if the house existed in a world separate from everything else. As she made her way to the entrance, the heavy wooden doors creaked open, and she was greeted by Mrs. Dudley, the housekeeper. A door woman with a cold demeanor, Mrs. Dudley made it clear that she had no interest in the guests or their experiments. She had one job, to keep the house running, and she wasn't going to stick around after dark. "I leave before nightfall," she said flatly, her voice devoid of emotion. "No one stays after dark." Eleanor shivered, unsure if the warning was meant for her or if it was just Mrs. Dudley's way of doing things. Either way, the message was clear. Hill House had its own rules, and the living didn't belong there once the sun went down. Soon after, Theodora and Luke arrived, both of them trying to mask their unease with light conversation. Dr. Montague greeted them warmly, his excitement barely contained. This was the beginning of his great experiment, and he was certain that Hill House would deliver the proof he sought. Together, the group explored the house, marveling at its grand but unsettling design. Every room felt wrong, the proportions were slightly off, and the angles made them feel like they were being watched. As night fell, the group gathered in the parlor, ready for the first of many nights at Hill House. Outside, the sun disappeared behind the hills, casting long shadows across the house. Inside, the air grew colder, and a heavy silence settled over them. Eleanor felt it first, a sense of dread creeping up her spine, as if the house was slowly closing in around her. She glanced at Theodora, who smiled, seemingly unaffected, but Eleanor could see the flicker of fear in her eyes. Luke, too, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Dr. Montague's voice broke the silence. "Welcome to Hill House," he said softly, "and may whatever walks here walk alone." But Eleanor knew, deep down, that they were never truly alone. Not in Hill House. The house had been waiting. The first night at Hill House was quiet, unnervingly so. No disturbances, no cold drafts, no ghostly whispers. Just a heavy, suffocating stillness that seemed to press in on all sides. For the group, this silence felt like a reprieve, though none of them voiced their relief aloud. Dr. Montague had warned them that the house would take time to reveal its secrets, and so they settled into the routine of exploring the mansion, observing its strange features and waiting for something to happen. Eleanor, in particular, was on edge. She had expected immediate signs of the supernatural, perhaps a door slamming on its own, or the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway. But Hill House didn't offer any such obvious signs. Instead, it exerted a quieter, more insidious influence. There was something unsettling in the air, something unseen yet always present. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching her, biding its time. Theodora, ever the optimist, treated the situation lightly. She made jokes to ease the tension, poking fun at the house's ominous reputation. "I was expecting more theatrics," she said one morning over breakfast. "A little poltergeist action, at least." Eleanor smiled, grateful for the attempt at levity, but the nagging sense of dread in the pit of her stomach never fully went away. Theodora seemed so at ease that Eleanor wondered if it was just a mask to hide her own unease. Luke, on the other hand, appeared disinterested. He spent his time lounging around, flipping through old books he found in the library, or lazily inspecting the rooms. For him, this was nothing more than a bizarre vacation, and his carefree attitude irritated Eleanor. How could he be so indifferent when Hill House felt so palpably dangerous? Dr. Montague remained the most focused. He wandered the halls with his notebook, jotting down every strange detail, even if it was nothing more than a creaky floorboard or a faint change in temperature. He believed that the house would eventually begin to manifest its true nature, and he was determined not to miss a single moment. The doctor's presence reassured Eleanor, but only slightly. His rational explanations provided a counterbalance to her growing anxiety. But as each day passed, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something was subtly changing inside her. As the days turned into nights, the group began to notice the small, almost imperceptible oddities that defined Hill House. The doors never stayed open, no matter how wide they were left. They always swung shut with a soft click, as if the house refused to let the outside world in. The angles of the rooms felt wrong, the corners too sharp or too curved, creating a sense of disorientation. At times, the halls seemed to stretch longer than they had before, as though the house were shifting itself around them. Eleanor found herself strangely drawn to the house, as if it were calling to her in some silent way. She would wander the halls alone, feeling a connection to the mansion she couldn't explain. The house's dark wood paneling and intricate carvings seemed to pulse with a life of their own. There were moments when Eleanor felt almost comforted by the oppressive stillness, as though Hill House understood her in a way no one else ever had. But along with that comfort came a growing sense of unease. Each night, Eleanor would wake in her bed, heart racing, convinced that someone or something was standing just outside her door. She would lie there, frozen, listening to the silence, trying to convince herself it was all in her mind. But the feeling of being watched never left her. The others began to feel it too. One evening, as they sat in the parlor, Theodora broke the silence with a nervous laugh. "Does anyone else feel like the house is staring at us?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. Luke raised an eyebrow, glancing around. "I wouldn't say staring," he replied, "but there's definitely something strange about this place." Dr. Montague nodded thoughtfully, as if he had expected this. "Hill House is known for its ability to influence," he said carefully. "It's not always about what you can see or hear. The house affects you in subtle ways. You might feel watched or uneasy, but it's all part of the experience. We must remain objective." Objective. Eleanor clung to that word, but it felt hollow. How could she remain objective when the walls themselves seemed to be closing in on her? She had never been one to believe in the supernatural, yet Hill House was doing something to her, something that made her question everything she thought she knew. The next night, the disturbances began in earnest. It started with a loud banging sound echoing through the house. The group was gathered in the parlor when the noise rang out, startling them all. Theodora jumped, knocking over her teacup, while Luke muttered a curse under his breath. Dr. Montague stood, listening carefully. "Did you hear where it came from?" he asked, his voice tense. Eleanor shook her head, her heart pounding. The noise seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating off the walls. Another bang followed, then another, growing louder and more insistent. The sound was unlike anything Eleanor had ever heard, deep, guttural, and impossibly loud, as if the house itself was groaning in pain. "Stay together," Dr. Montague instructed, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. They huddled together, listening as the noise continued to echo through the halls. After what felt like an eternity, the banging stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind an eerie silence. Eleanor's breath came in shallow gasps. She could feel her pulse racing, her skin cold with fear. She wanted to believe it was just a structural issue old houses creaked, after all, but deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. Hill House was waking up, and it was starting to reach out. That night, the group decided to retire early, but sleep was elusive. Eleanor lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her. She closed her eyes, trying to force herself to sleep, but the unease lingered. It was then that she heard a soft voice, barely audible, calling her name. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but the voice came again, clearer this time. "Eleanor," it whispered, gentle yet insistent. Her eyes flew open, and she sat up in bed, heart pounding. The voice was coming from outside her door, just beyond the threshold. She swallowed, gripping the edges of the blanket tightly. Was someone playing a cruel trick on her, or was this the house? The possibility of either terrified her. She stayed frozen in bed, unable to move, until the voice faded into the silence once more. The fear lingered, even after the sound was gone, and Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the house had spoken to her, personally, intimately, in a way that no one else had experienced. Hill House was no longer just a house. It was something more, something alive. And Eleanor feared it had chosen her. The first night at Hill House was quiet, unnervingly so. No disturbances, no cold drafts, no ghostly whispers. Just a heavy, suffocating stillness that seemed to press in on all sides. For the group, this silence felt like a reprieve, though none of them voiced their relief aloud. Dr. Montague had warned them that the house would take time to reveal its secrets, and so they settled into the routine of exploring the mansion, observing its strange features, and waiting for something to happen. Eleanor, in particular, was on edge. She had expected immediate signs of the supernatural, perhaps a door slamming on its own, or the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway. But Hill House didn't offer any such obvious signs. Instead, it exerted a quieter, more insidious influence. There was something unsettling in the air, something unseen yet always present. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching her, biding its time. Theodora, ever the optimist, treated the situation lightly. She made jokes to ease the tension, poking fun at the house's ominous reputation. "I was expecting more theatrics," she said one morning over breakfast. "A little poltergeist action, at least." Eleanor smiled, grateful for the attempt at levity, but the nagging sense of dread in the pit of her stomach never fully went away. Theodora seemed so at ease, but Eleanor wondered if it was just a mask to hide her own unease. Luke, on the other hand, appeared disinterested. He spent his time lounging around, flipping through old books he found in the library, or lazily inspecting the rooms. For him, this was nothing more than a bizarre vacation, and his carefree attitude irritated Eleanor. How could he be so indifferent when Hill House felt so palpably dangerous? Dr. Montague remained the most focused. He wandered the halls with his notebook, jotting down every strange detail, even if it was nothing more than a creaky floorboard or a faint change in temperature. He believed that the house would eventually begin to manifest its true nature, and he was determined not to miss a single moment. The doctor's presence reassured Eleanor, but only slightly. His rational explanations provided a counterbalance to her growing anxiety. But as each day passed, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something was subtly changing inside her. As the days turned into nights, the group began to notice the small, almost imperceptible oddities that defined Hill House. The doors never stayed open, no matter how wide they were left. They always swung shut with a soft click, as if the house refused to let the outside world in. The angles of the rooms felt wrong, the corners too sharp or too curved, creating a sense of disorientation. At times, the halls seemed to stretch longer than they had before, as though the house were shifting itself around them. Eleanor found herself strangely drawn to the house, as if it were calling to her in some silent way. She would wander the halls alone, feeling a connection to the mansion she couldn't explain. The house's dark wood paneling and intricate carvings seemed to pulse with a life of their own. There were moments when Eleanor felt almost comforted by the oppressive stillness, as though Hill House understood her in a way no one else ever had. But along with that comfort came a growing sense of unease. Each night, Eleanor would wake in her bed, heart racing, convinced that someone or something was standing just outside her door. She would lie there, frozen, listening to the silence, trying to convince herself it was all in her mind. But the feeling of being watched never left her. The others began to feel it too. One evening, as they sat in the parlor, Theodora broke the silence with a nervous laugh. "Does anyone else feel like the house is staring at us?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. Luke raised an eyebrow, glancing around. "I wouldn't say staring," he replied, "but there's definitely something strange about this place." Dr. Montague nodded thoughtfully, as if he had expected this. "Hill House is known for its ability to influence," he said carefully. "It's not always about what you can see or hear. The house affects you in subtle ways. You might feel watched or uneasy, but it's all part of the experience. We must remain objective." Objective. Eleanor clung to that word, but it felt hollow. How could she remain objective when the walls themselves seemed to be closing in on her? She had never been one to believe in the supernatural, yet Hill House was doing something to her, something that made her question everything she thought she knew. The next night, the disturbances began in earnest. It started with a loud banging sound echoing through the house. The group was gathered in the parlor when the noise rang out, startling them all. Theodora jumped, knocking over her teacup, while Luke muttered a curse under his breath. Dr. Montague stood, listening carefully. "Did you hear where it came from?" he asked, his voice tense. Eleanor shook her head, her heart pounding. The noise seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating off the walls. Another bang followed, then another, growing louder and more insistent. The sound was unlike anything Eleanor had ever heard, deep, guttural, and impossibly loud, as if the house itself was groaning in pain. "Stay together," Dr. Montague instructed, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. They huddled together, listening as the noise continued to echo through the halls. After what felt like an eternity, the banging stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind an eerie silence. Eleanor's breath came in shallow gasps. She could feel her pulse racing, her skin cold with fear. She wanted to believe it was just a structural issue old houses creaked, after all, but deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. Hill House was waking up, and it was starting to reach out. That night, the group decided to retire early, but sleep was elusive. Eleanor lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her. She closed her eyes, trying to force herself to sleep, but the unease lingered. It was then that she heard a soft voice, barely audible, calling her name. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but the voice came again, clearer this time. "Eleanor." It whispered, gentle yet insistent. Her eyes flew open, and she sat up in bed, heart pounding. The voice was coming from outside her door, just beyond the threshold. She swallowed, gripping the edges of the blanket tightly. Was someone playing a cruel trick on her, or was this the house? The possibility of either terrified her. She stayed frozen in bed, unable to move, until the voice faded into the silence once more. The fear lingered, even after the sound was gone, and Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the house had spoken to her personally, intimately, in a way that no one else had experienced. Hill House was no longer just a house. It was something more, something alive, and Eleanor feared it had chosen her. The days in Hill House began to blur, each one bleeding into the next. The once playful atmosphere among the group had grown tense, weighed down by the increasing strangeness that seemed to infest every corner of the mansion. The subtle disturbances that had started with noises and inexplicable cold spots were now escalating into something far more sinister. Eleanor felt it most acutely. Each night, her dreams became more vivid, more disorienting. Shadows danced across her room, and she swore she could hear whispers, the same voice that had called her name that first night. The voice no longer startled her, though. Instead, she found herself listening for it, waiting for it to speak again. And when it did, it was almost comforting, as though the house understood her deepest thoughts and longings. But that comfort came with a price. Hill House was changing Eleanor. Where once she had been shy, withdrawn, and uncertain, now she felt a strange, dark confidence creeping in. It wasn't the kind of confidence that made her feel stronger. It was more like a weight pressing down on her, pushing her to let go of her old self. Every time she wandered the house alone, she felt it pulling her further into its grasp, as if it was slowly becoming a part of her. The others noticed the change in her, but no one spoke of it directly. Theodora, ever sensitive to the emotions of those around her, had grown distant from Eleanor. Where they once shared a bond, an unspoken tension now lingered between them. Theodora still laughed and joked, but her gaze had become sharp, suspicious. She was watching Eleanor carefully, as if she were afraid of what her friend might do, or perhaps of what the house might do to her. One evening, as they gathered in the parlor, Theodora finally confronted Eleanor, though her words were veiled in humor. "You're looking a little pale, Eleanor," she said with a playful smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Hill House isn't agreeing with you, is it?" Eleanor bristled at the comment, her nerves already frayed from the sleepless nights and the constant feeling of being watched. "I'm fine," she snapped, more harshly than she intended. She immediately regretted it, but the words were out, and she saw the flicker of surprise and perhaps fear in Theodora's expression. Dr. Montague, ever the mediator, stepped in to ease the tension. "We're all under a lot of stress," he said calmly. "Hill House has a way of playing tricks on the mind. It's important that we stick together and not let the house influence us." But even as he spoke, the house seemed to respond. A loud, hollow knock echoed through the walls, as if something was rapping on the wood from within. The noise reverberated through the room, freezing them in place. Eleanor's heart pounded as she listened. It wasn't just a random sound. It was deliberate, rhythmic, almost as if someone or something was trying to get in. Luke, who had been lounging carelessly in his chair, jumped to his feet, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, his usual nonchalance gone. Dr. Montague motioned for calm, but the tension was thick in the air. "Everyone stay together," he ordered. "We've prepared for this. It's just the house. It's reacting to us." Reacting. Eleanor felt the word sink into her mind like a stone. The house wasn't just reacting, it was communicating. She could feel it. It was reaching out, trying to make contact, and she was the one it had chosen. The knocking continued, growing louder and more insistent. The group huddled closer together, their fear palpable. For a moment, Eleanor felt an overwhelming urge to flee, to escape the house's grasp and never look back. But even as the thought crossed her mind, another voice, her own, but darker, quieter, whispered inside her, "This is where you belong. Don't leave. Not yet." The noise abruptly stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. The group sat frozen, their breaths shallow, waiting for the next attack, but nothing came. After what felt like hours, Dr. Montague finally spoke. "It's over for now," he said, though his voice was tense. "We need to stay vigilant. The house is testing us." They retired to their rooms early that night, though none of them expected to sleep. Eleanor lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, the events of the evening replaying in her mind. The knocking, the tension, Theodora's strange look, all of it felt like a warning. But from whom? From the house? Or from herself? Sleep, when it finally came, was shallow and filled with disturbing dreams. Eleanor found herself wandering through the dark corridors of Hill House, but the walls were different now, closer, more confining. They seemed to pulse with life, breathing in sync with her own panicked breaths. As she walked, the floor shifted beneath her feet, and the air grew thick, almost suffocating. In her dream, the house whispered to her again, that same familiar voice. "You can't leave, Eleanor. You don't want to. This is where you're meant to be." She awoke in a cold sweat, her heart racing. For a moment, she didn't know where she was, the dream still clinging to her like a second skin. The room was dark, the shadows deep and unfamiliar, but the overwhelming sense of being watched was all too real. Eleanor glanced at the door. It was closed, just as she had left it, but something was wrong, she could feel it. Slowly, she swung her legs over the side of the bed, her feet touching the cold floor. She stood, hesitating for a moment, then moved toward the door, her heart pounding in her ears. When she opened it, the hallway stretched out before her, empty and silent. But the moment she stepped outside, she felt the temperature drop. The cold wrapped around her like a tight grip, and the air seemed to hum with a low, steady vibration. She wasn't alone. Something was out there, lurking just beyond the edge of her vision. The whisper came again, soft but insistent. "Come closer, Eleanor." She didn't move. She couldn't. Her body felt frozen, as if the house had taken control of her limbs, holding her in place. The whisper grew louder, more demanding, as if it were coming from inside her own mind. "Closer." Eleanor clenched her fists, fighting the urge to move, to obey. But the pull was too strong. She took one step forward, then another, her feet moving of their own accord. The shadows in the hallway seemed to shift, growing darker until they almost swallowed her whole. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the feeling vanished. The cold dissipated, the air returned to normal, and Eleanor was left standing in the middle of the hallway, trembling. She didn't know how long she stood there, but when she finally gathered the strength to return to her room, she collapsed onto the bed, exhausted and terrified. The next morning, she told no one what had happened. Not Theodora, not Dr. Montague, not even Luke, who seemed as unaffected by the house as ever. But Eleanor knew that something inside her had changed. The house had touched her, reached into her mind, and planted a seed of doubt that was slowly growing. Hill House was no longer just a building. It was something more, a living entity, feeding off their fear, twisting their thoughts, and slowly unraveling their sense of reality. And Eleanor, whether she admitted it or not, was becoming part of it. By the time the fourth week in Hill House arrived, the atmosphere had shifted from eerie to oppressive. Every inch of the house seemed charged with a malevolent energy that none of them could fully explain. No longer content with subtle whispers and cold drafts, the house had grown more active, more aggressive. It was as if the mansion itself was waking up, and its attention was fixed on Eleanor. Theodora, once a source of comfort with her sharp wit and playful teasing, now kept her distance from Eleanor. The tension between them was palpable, and Eleanor couldn't ignore the feeling that Theodora was afraid of her, or rather, of what the house was doing to her. The unspoken barrier between them only made Eleanor feel more isolated, more trapped in her own mind. She began to question whether Theodora had ever truly been her friend, or if she had just been pretending all along. Luke, who had never taken the Hauntings seriously, was becoming more and more irritable. His usual carefree attitude had given way to frustration, and he spent much of his time pacing through the house, as though he was searching for an escape. But there was no escape, not from Hill House. The mansion's strange geometry seemed to twist and turn in on itself, making the corridors feel endless and the rooms disorienting. Even when they tried to leave, the house had a way of leading them back inside. Dr. Montague was still focused on his research, scribbling notes with frantic determination. But even he was beginning to show signs of strain. His once calm demeanor had cracked, revealing the deep anxiety beneath. The house was proving more powerful than he had anticipated, and though he tried to maintain a scientific detachment, it was clear that Hill House had shaken him. He had lost control of the experiment, and he knew it. Eleanor, meanwhile, was slipping further into the house's grip. Her dreams had become darker, more vivid, and the line between reality and imagination was blurring. She could no longer tell if the strange things she was experiencing were real or if the house was playing tricks on her mind. The whispers had become more frequent, more persistent, and they no longer scared her. In fact, she had started to listen to them, to find comfort in their words. They understand me. The house understands me. It was a dangerous thought, but Eleanor couldn't help it. The more isolated she felt from the others, the more she turned to the house for comfort. It whispered to her, telling her that she belonged there, that she didn't need the others. And Eleanor began to believe it. One night, after another unsettling evening filled with unexplained noises and shifting shadows, Eleanor found herself wandering the halls of Hill House alone. She didn't know what had drawn her out of bed. Perhaps it was the pull of the house, or perhaps it was her own restless mind. Either way, she found herself moving through the mansion's darkened corridors, the wooden floorboards creaking softly beneath her feet. The house seemed to breathe around her, its very walls pulsating with a strange energy. Eleanor felt calm, almost serene, as if she were finally where she was meant to be. For the first time in her life, she felt seen. Truly seen. She came to a door at the end of the hallway, one she had never noticed before. It was slightly ajar, as if inviting her inside. Without hesitation, she pushed it open and stepped into the room beyond. It was a small, dimly lit space with a single window that looked out over the dark, empty grounds of Hill House. The air in the room was cold, but Eleanor didn't feel the chill. Instead, she felt a strange warmth radiating from the center of the room. There, in the middle of the floor, was a mirror. Its surface was cracked, the fractured glass reflecting distorted images of the room and of Eleanor herself. She stepped closer, staring at her reflection. Her face looked pale, drawn, and tired, but there was something else in her eyes, something dark and unfamiliar. The mirror whispered to her, "You don't need them. They're holding you back. You've always been alone, Eleanor, but here, you can be free. You can be yourself." Eleanor's hands trembled as she reached out to touch the mirror's cracked surface. The moment her fingers brushed the glass, she felt a surge of energy course through her. It wasn't painful, but it was overwhelming, like the house itself was pouring its power into her. For a brief, terrifying moment, Eleanor felt as though she were losing herself. The weight of her loneliness, her grief, her anger, it all pressed down on her, threatening to consume her. But the house whispered again, soothing her. "Let go, Eleanor. Let go of who you were. Be free." And she did. In that moment, standing before the cracked mirror, Eleanor let go. She let go of the years she had spent caring for her mother, of the bitterness and resentment that had built up inside her. She let go of the shame, the regret, the feeling of being invisible. And as she did, she felt something shift within her, something dark, something powerful. The house had given her a gift. It had taken her pain, her loneliness, and turned it into something else. Something stronger. When Eleanor returned to the others the next morning, they noticed the change immediately. Her demeanor was different, calmer, more assured, but there was something unsettling about the way she carried herself. Theodora watched her with wary eyes, while Luke seemed to avoid her altogether. Even Dr. Montague appeared unnerved, though he said nothing. That day, the disturbances escalated. The walls groaned under an invisible pressure, and strange, unexplainable phenomena occurred throughout the house. Doors slammed shut with deafening force, and objects moved on their own. It was as if Hill House was coming alive, feeding off the group's fear and uncertainty. And through it all, Eleanor remained calm. She no longer felt afraid of the house. She felt connected to it. The house had chosen her, and she had accepted it. But Theodora wasn't fooled. That evening, as they sat together in the parlor, Theodora turned to Eleanor, her voice low and tense. "What's happening to you?" she asked. Her eyes narrowed. "You're not the same, Eleanor. You're different." Eleanor smiled, but it wasn't the warm, shy smile she had once worn. It was something colder, more distant. "I'm fine," she said softly. "I just realized something, that's all." Theodora shook her head, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "This house is doing something to you. It's trying to take you. Don't you see that?" Eleanor's smile faded. "Maybe I don't want to leave," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe this is where I belong." Theodora stared at her, horrified. "Eleanor, no. This isn't you. The house is manipulating you." But Eleanor had stopped listening. The house's whispers were louder now, drowning out Theodora's voice. "You don't need her. She's afraid of you. She'll never understand." And Eleanor believed it. She no longer needed the others. Hill House had given her something far more valuable, a sense of belonging, a place where she could finally be free. The cracks that had formed in her mind were spreading, and Eleanor could feel herself slipping further and further into the house's grasp. She didn't fight it. In the days that followed, the manifestations grew more violent. The house was unraveling, its dark energy seeping into every corner, every crevice. The others tried to reason with Eleanor, to pull her back, but it was too late. Hill House had claimed her, and she had let it. The house had become her refuge, her sanctuary, and she wasn't going to leave. Not ever. The final days in Hill House were a descent into chaos. The mansion, once eerie but manageable, now seemed intent on consuming those within it. Every room, every hallway felt a malevolent energy that no one could ignore. The subtle games Hill House had played, the knocks, the whispers, were gone. Now it was a full assault. The house wanted them out. Or worse, it wanted to trap them there forever. Eleanor had fully surrendered to its pull. Her connection to the house had deepened to the point where she could no longer tell where she ended and Hill House began. The whispers that had once haunted her in the dark now filled her mind even in the daylight. They were no longer warnings or invitations. They were commands, insistent and relentless. "Stay. You belong here. Let go of everything else. This is your home." Dr. Montague was the first to openly acknowledge the danger Eleanor was in. His once scientific curiosity had turned into concern. "We need to leave," he said to the group, his voice strained with the realization that he had lost control of the situation. "The house is becoming dangerous, especially for Eleanor. It's influencing her, perhaps more than we understand." But Eleanor wasn't listening. She was sitting by the window, gazing out into the bleak, foggy landscape that surrounded Hill House. Her expression was distant, almost peaceful, as though she was no longer part of the conversation. In her mind, the house was all that mattered. The outside world had become irrelevant. Theodora's patience had long since run out. "We can't just sit here and watch this happen," she snapped, her usual sharpness undercut by real fear. She glanced over at Eleanor, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and concern. She's not herself anymore. The house has taken her, and we have to do something. Luke, standing near the door, looked ready to leave at any moment. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by a cold, hard fear that he couldn't shake. "We've stayed too long," he muttered. "We need to get out while we still can." But Eleanor wasn't leaving. She had made that clear. And more than that, the house wouldn't let her go. The others could sense it. Hill House had its grip on her, and it wasn't about to loosen. That night, the house showed its full power. The walls shook, the floors groaned, and doors slammed with a force that rattled the entire structure. It felt like the house was coming apart at the seams, but instead of fear, Eleanor felt exhilaration. The house was alive, and it was speaking to her. It wanted her. As the others scrambled in panic, trying to figure out whether to flee or huddle together in safety, Eleanor moved calmly through the chaos. The shadows seemed to reach for her, embracing her as she walked through the darkened halls. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, but they no longer frightened her. "You are home, Eleanor. This is where you've always belonged." The others tried to stop her. Theodora reached for her arm, pleading with her to come back to reality. But Eleanor pulled away with a strength that startled her friend. Dr. Montague tried to reason with her, his voice breaking with desperation, but his words didn't reach her. Luke, too scared to even approach her, watched from a distance, his face pale and drawn. Eleanor moved toward the grand staircase, her steps slow and deliberate. The house had led her there, guiding her to this final moment. The staircase loomed before her, a towering symbol of the house's power. She could feel the air around her vibrating with energy, as if the house itself was alive, watching her every move. As she stood at the top of the stairs, the voices filled her mind completely. "End it here, Eleanor. This is your final step. It's the only way to be free." For a brief moment, Eleanor hesitated. She looked down at the others below, their faces filled with horror and helplessness. But their fear felt distant to her now. The house had become her reality, and the people she once called friends were just shadows in her mind. Then, without another thought, Eleanor let herself go. But as she took the step forward, something in her shifted. A small, quiet voice, her own, fought its way through the cacophony of whispers. "Is this really what I want?" For a moment, Eleanor faltered. The house seemed to tighten its grip, but her mind, buried deep beneath the house's influence, was fighting back. She thought of the life she had left behind, lonely, yes, but still hers. She remembered the kindness of strangers, the feeling of sunlight on her face, the warmth of a world beyond Hill House. Was it really too late to turn back? But the house was relentless. There is no turning back. This is where you belong. You can't escape now. The others watched in horror as Eleanor wavered at the top of the staircase. Dr. Montague shouted her name, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. Theodora cried out, rushing toward the stairs, but Luke held her back, too afraid of what Eleanor might do. And then, with a final, shattering cry, Eleanor stepped forward. The house roared around her as she fell. Time seemed to slow as she tumbled down the stairs, her body twisting in the air. The others rushed to her, their footsteps pounding against the floor as they raced to catch her. But it was too late. Eleanor lay crumpled at the base of the staircase, her eyes closed, her body still. For a moment, there was only silence. The house, as if satisfied, seemed to calm. The groaning walls, the slamming doors, they all stopped. Hill House was still, as though it had finally taken what it wanted. Dr. Montague knelt beside Eleanor, his hands shaking as he checked for signs of life. Theodora stood frozen, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. Luke hovered nearby, his usual bravado gone, replaced by a hollow fear. But Eleanor was alive. She stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open, and for a brief moment, she looked at the others as though seeing them for the first time in weeks. Her voice, weak but clear, broke the silence. I'm sorry," she whispered. The house remained quiet as they gathered her up, carrying her carefully to her room. The others didn't speak, their minds too overwhelmed by what had happened. Eleanor, too weak to stand, allowed herself to be led away. As she lay in bed that night, her body aching, her mind exhausted, Eleanor finally understood. Hill House had tried to take her, but something within her had resisted. She had come to the edge, looked into the abyss, and somehow she had pulled back. For now. But the house wasn't done with her. She could still feel its pull, still hear its whispers in the back of her mind. The fight wasn't over, and Eleanor knew it. Hill House was a living thing, and it didn't let go easily. As the house settled into its familiar, oppressive silence, Eleanor closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she would leave. She had to. But part of her wondered if she would ever truly be free of Hill House, or if it had already taken more of her than she realized. And that, my friends, is the dark tale of the haunting of Hill House, a place where echoes of the past linger and shadows may never truly vanish. What do you think? Does Hill House still hold secrets waiting to be uncovered? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed diving into this haunting story, please give the video a like, and don't forget to subscribe to Scary Stories for more chilling tales. Thank you for watching. And remember, sometimes the scariest things are the ones you can't see. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.